Welcome to everyone. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network, which is previously the Manning Center. This is incredibly exciting today. We've got over 1,200 people registered to attend, and much of the credit is owed to Jocelyn Banford, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Business of Canada, through sheer force of will, has really pushed to get as many people out to attend this event today as possible. So thank you, Jocelyn. I also want to thank our other partners. We had other organizations involved in really pushing to get this event well attended. Project Confederation, the Alberta Institute, a Modern Miracle Network. So I know Josh, Peter, Becky, you're all probably listening. Please put links to your organization in the comment box, and so that our folks that are joining us today can find out more about your organizations. To answer the question that often comes up, yes, this session will be recorded and it will be posted to our website later this afternoon, canadastrongandfree.network. You can Google that and see it there under the Events and Activities tab. So here's how today is going to go. We have a live comment box you can bring up, and we encourage you to post comments while the discussion's going on. We also encourage our speakers to post comments and to read those comments as we go. If there's a useful link that might be helpful to the people that are viewing today, please drop that into the live comments box as well. Separate from that, at the bottom of the page, you'll find a Q&A box. Now, I had over 91 questions I counted came in advance. And what I'm doing the best we can is to try and group those into subject matter to put to our panelists as the discussion goes on today. But please do put questions directly into the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring it. David's also helping me, and we'll try and summarize and get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Okay, let's get into the discussion. Economic Triage, righting the ship for Canada. I want to thank our panelists, Pierre, Jack, and Dan. Hopefully Pierre's on by now. He said he was having some trouble getting in. And I also want to thank our moderator today, Catherine Swift. Thank you so much for doing this. Great as always to have you involved and to be working with you on a project like this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Catherine, to introduce the panel and say a few words to get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Troy, and thank you for co-hosting this today. We are certainly gratified to have the number of attendees that we have. That's been delightful, and I think it just underlines the importance of this topic to so many Canadians. And when I was thinking of the opening remarks I was going to make, I was thinking that it really wasn't very long ago that if you spoke of some plan by the United Nations and some other international agencies to establish a global government that would dramatically restructure Western economies, impose climate policies that would ban reliable and affordable energy sources in favor of high-cost, unreliable ones, reorganize financial markets along ideological lines, drastically change immigration policies, and fundamentally upend our way of life, well, you would have been accused of having your tinfoil hat on a little too tight. However, today, more and more people are becoming familiar with the buzzwords like the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, resilient recovery, and Build Back Better. And in fact, it's interesting that we've had this session planned for a while now, but in just the last few days, we've seen both Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden express their support for these concepts numerous times. So all of these expressions are just different ways of saying the same thing, which is an unprecedented plan to undertake a complete reorganization of our Western market-based economies and societies in exchange for a globalized, socialized structure in which an international elite is in charge and national sovereignty is ultimately threatened. This plan, I think, is best laid out by the United Nations and the World Economic Forum in a number of different documents, the UN 2030, for example. And it's really quite frightening to anyone that values freedom, democracy, and market-based economies. A key component of this master plan is to phase out economic sectors such as fossil fuels and other resource industries, which have contributed massively to Canada's prosperity for many decades and have raised the standard of living for average Canadians. This isn't only bad news for the energy producing provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, but for all of the many other businesses right across Canada in every province that are dependent on the energy sector. And although this master plan has been underway for some years, the pandemic has been seized upon by its supporters as a pretext to speed up progress on this agenda, which favors big government, industries such as the so-called green sector, which require immense taxpayer subsidies, tax dollars funneled to the so-called social entrepreneurs, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and other fake businesses that cannot exist without government support, and yet they compete with the true private businesses. The growth in this phony business sector has been explosive in the last 20 years or so. And in addition to consuming many tax dollars, they can also be counted on to work in a partisan way in elections to help elect politicians and political parties which perpetuate big government, and that usually in Canadian circles tends to be Liberals. Canada is further along this road than most other countries, as the current Liberal government, some provincial governments, virtually all major Canadian cities, and most large corporations have signed on to things like the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Policies like carbon taxes, changed immigration policies, punitive measures toward the oil and gas sector to retard its development, the adoption of UN declarations such as UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, and many more are just examples that are already in force to varying degrees. The end game of the master plan will be a lowered standard of living for average Canadians, less freedom, threats to things like private property ownership and the small business sector. And those things are bulwarks of the middle class in any society. And a move away from the open market economic model that has succeeded so well to reduce poverty and create opportunity globally. The Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada has a better plan. We have established a group called Canadians for a Responsible Recovery. It can be found online at responsiblerecovery.ca. And it focuses on the policies that promote the productive sector of the economy, the people that contribute to the bottom line, the manufacturers, resource companies, and so many other businesses that have kept the economy functioning during the pandemic and are positive contributors to employment, economic growth, and government revenues, not the fake businesses or other entities that need continual taxpayer subsidy to exist. In about the next hour or so, we're going to hear from an expert panel on different aspects of this so-called Build Back Better resilient recovery framework, the impacts on Canada, and what are better approaches that we can take to ensure a truly responsible recovery and promote positive policies that will work to everyone's benefit, not just the elite, enable Canada to emerge from the pandemic stronger and better prepared for the future, not irrevocably weakened and damaged. No one voted for this globalist agenda, and it's high time Canadians got informed and expressed their strong opposition before it's too late. Each of our panel members is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and we will have a question and answer period after all three have spoken. So please use the chat function and the Q&A function on your screens. Our first speaker is Dan McTeague. Dan has had a long and distinguished career in private industry as a Liberal member of Parliament for, I think it was 18 years, Dan. And of course, an expert on gas pricing and energy issues. Dan is currently the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Dan.
Catherine, thank you for this introduction, and my congratulations to Jocelyn Bamford and the CCNBC. Troy, thank you for making all this possible. Who would have known that the only time in which you can get a lot of people together is in a pandemic, and virtual reality of somebody joining an audience on such an important topic. But it is the topic of our times, and it's clear that over time, governments have taken the liberty of using the distraction of the pandemic, which is serious, in order to foist upon us an agenda and perhaps one that most Canadians seem to be unfamiliar with. There's a reason why 1,200 of you are joining us today, and that's because none of you have been consulted about what this government is doing or what it plans to do. And yet the implications aren't necessarily for them. The implications are on you, not just in terms of policy that you didn't vote for, but policies which are going to have dramatic impacts on your livelihood and your standard of living. So whether it is the ban on plastics, whether it is the imposition on the clean fuel standard, which I'm going to talk about at significant length here, or whether it happens to be carbon taxes, successive series of carbon taxes, or whether it is spending without unaccountability. I'll allow Jack Mintz and others to speak more forcefully to that. We are dealing in a time where there is very little accountability, very little transparency. All of the things that governments should be known for, especially at a time of crisis, we are seeing the exact opposite. And it's for that reason that Canadians for Affordable Energy, which I'm very proud to represent as its president, needs to bring to light the significant cost implications for Canadians. Now, I come from Ontario. I'm quite familiar with the last or first round of attempt at green energy and its implications. I'll be looking for my hydro bill around a week or two before Christmas to see that it's gone up yet again 2 to 3%. And for consumers across Ontario, a more than greater doubling of the project of the cost. And of course, while businesses have borne a lot of that, thanks to people like Jocelyn who've been able to mitigate some of that work with the current government, the reality is that as we find ever more creative ways to destroy the very thing that is unique about Canada, that provides money for our social services, that provides prosperity for Canadians, we are looking at a government that is simply willing to throw that aside in favor of an agenda which is both unknown, unheard of, and certainly untested. And where it has been tested, it has led to extremely high cost distorting impacts on all of us. I look with 5 children of my own to the future and wonder whether or not the promise of what has attracted so many to Canada and what has been given us and has bequeathed us, perhaps the greatest standard of living of our time, is something that we should simply trade away through ignorance, or those who believe that somehow the world as we understand it is going to come to an end in 10 years and therefore cast everything away that's important. I note that some of the municipal councils in my area here, Halton to the north of where I am, I'm in Oakville right now, Hamilton, and of course Kitchener, with big, strong connections to Green as well as to the Liberal Party, a party that I'm familiar with after having served it for over 38 years, half of that as a member of Parliament, part of that as a Privy Councillor. I see that we are trivializing things like natural gas, a clean form of energy that has really served as a bulwark to ensure that Canadians have affordable energy, can meet the demands that we need during a winter period of time, and has provided us opportunities to export around the world to bring down, if you will, the emissions that we're seeing. We also know and recognize that this is a government in Ottawa that doesn't know how to sign a treaty. The willingness to stand behind the Paris Accord, an accord that uniquely punishes Canada for the good work in dropping emissions prior to 2005, is not lost on some of us who wonder why that was done. Easy for the Americans to meet a target since they're shutting coal plants down after 2005. Canada had done that well before that to a large extent. And even if we were just able to sell natural gas and greater forms of clean energy, things that we give no credit for, and ensure that there's an adequacy of supply at affordable prices for our manufacturing sector, we still get no credit for being able to sell natural gas as an alternative to the Indias, the Chinas, the Indonesias, and others from building coal plants and therefore increasing the global carbon footprint. So it's a bad policy. It's not only bad internationally, it's bad for Canada, it's bad for consumers. And I would really want to reflect with all of you here as you make those questions available, that we really try to focus on why this government has done so much to cover up just about everything that it's done, proposes a project that we know will be disastrous. And of course, coming from a government that refuses to present a budget, I have my concerns as a former Liberal member of Parliament. I thank you, look forward to your questions, and looking forward to my other colleagues and hosts here in terms of their commentary. Thanks very much, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Pierre Poilievre. Pierre has been a Conservative MP since 2004. Probably one of the youngest MPs in Canada. Pierre held cabinet positions in the Harper government in the portfolios of democratic reform and employment and social development. And he's currently the finance critic for the Conservative Party, spending his time making life miserable for Liberals on the finance and other committees, as well as in the House of Commons. And we thank you for that, Pierre. A dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Anyway, please take it away, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Catherine. What a distinguished panel to be a part of today. Catherine, who's been a lifelong warrior for the entrepreneurial class, Jack Mintz, who has more tax and economic knowledge in his pinky finger than most governments have in their entire cabinets. Dan McTeague, who is Canada's preeminent expert on energy economics, whom I grudgingly admired, even when he was on the other side of the House, in a very different Liberal Party back when Liberals believed in free markets and balanced budgets and low taxes. So it is an honor for me to be among such a distinguished group. And we do have some very important matters here today to discuss. The pandemic has led to an explosion in the size, scope, and power of government. Government spending as a share of GDP has risen to 55%. That's the combined spending of all three levels of government. That is higher than at any time in Canadian history, with the possible exception of the Second World War. It is even higher than during the previous Trudeau. Our deficit at 17% of GDP is now bigger than at any time outside of 1942 and 43, when it reached just over 20%. But I quickly point out that in the years immediately following World War II, our ancestors ran the biggest surpluses in Canadian history in order to quickly repay the national debt and return our finances to order after they had conquered Hitler and the fascists in the war. So we are seeing a massive explosion in the size and cost of government. It's not exactly clear who's benefiting from all of this government. Now, our friends will quickly point out that the CERB, the wage subsidy, and the small business loans have gone directly to Canadians, and they're right about that. Many people have benefited from those things, but they only account for $180 billion out of the $380 billion deficit we now face. So all of us probably agree the need for an income support and employer support program was required to compensate workers and businesses for the government's decision to shut them down. But that direct support accounts for less than half of the massive deficits that we're running today. In fact, the $380 billion deficit falls on the shoulders of 38 million Canadian taxpayers, equaling $10,000 for every man, woman, and child, or $40,000 in new debt for the average family of four. I don't know any family that has received $40,000 of COVID relief since March. There have been some who've received the CERB, but few have received more than $8,000 per person, and that's in the most extreme circumstances. I have not met a single family that can say that as a household they have received 40 grand. So where is all of this money going? The answer, of course, is it is being vaporized by the ecosystem of parasites that have latched themselves onto this government in Ottawa. This is there has been a boom in two sectors in the Canadian economy. Well, actually three, in fairness. One, government, which has grown exponentially. Two, lobbying. The amount of registered lobbying has exploded in this regime because businesses understand that you get return on investment by investing in political influence rather than by investing in machines and knowledge and technology. Now you invest in purchasing political interest by renting influential people who can convert their influence into money for your business. And that is the nature of state enterprise, that where in the free market system, you get rich by having the best product. In state-controlled economies, you get rich by having the best lobbyists. And this is backed up by decades of research by economists who focus on public choice theory. The great James Buchanan, Nobel Prize economist, wrote about public choice theory. He said it's politics without the romance. And in it, he explained that businesses carry out the same self-interested behavior within a governmental system that they would in a private sector. If the government decides who gets what, then businesses invest in getting a larger share from the government at the expense of everyone else. And every other interest does likewise. And I can tell you it is a feast right now in Ottawa. The WE scandal was just a glimpse, a small glimpse into the frenzy of piranhas who are attacking the taxpayer on Parliament Hill right now in order to secure grants for this, that, and the other, leading to, as I said, the most expensive combined cost of government at any time in Canadian history. Can you imagine that only 45% of our economy is the free market and 55% is governmentally controlled? Now, one might say, look, this is a pandemic. What can we do in a pandemic but to expand government? And to some limited degree, that is true. We obviously needed government to replace people's incomes, etc., buy PPE and deliver the basic essentials of a response. I would note that it has failed in all of those primary areas. But I would also note the government is now talking about permanent expansions. They want to take over your daycare, your drug plan, and your seniors home. And for a government that has lost track of the whereabouts, the cost, and the project description of 20,000 infrastructure projects that can't properly pay its own employees, do you really want them running your daycare, your drug plan, and your seniors home? I suspect we all know the answer to that question. But this expansion of government is part of a larger agenda that is now coming to light. And I just happened to pull up a report from the World Economic Forum, which is pushing forward this idea of a great reset. They say they want the great lockdown generation to be transformed into the great reset generation. And I'm going to read you some very brief quotes from their report. However, certain restrictions, especially those relating to technological surveillance, could be maintained beyond the pandemic, challenging some core civil liberties. Furthermore, the report says, and I'm quoting here directly, how can the declaration of victory over the virus be timed correctly and the opportunity to build back better be seized without fail? Timed? I'm sorry, are we timing victory over the virus to achieve some political objective? I thought the timing of victory over the virus was supposed to be as soon as possible. Aren't we supposed to be scrambling to defeat this virus and end this pandemic as quickly as we can so people can safely get back to work and families can visit their elderly before they die alone in nursing homes? Or is there some other timing that would be more beneficial to the World Economic Forum? So that is what is at stake. You know, when you have quotes like that are right in the heart of the World Economic Forum, this isn't some two-bit Marxist website somewhere. This is one of the most prestigious international bodies of which the leading, the international corporate elite is members and pays big dollars to attend its conferences. And they're writing about how they want to, quote unquote, time the victory over the virus, that they think that we should consider permanent surveillance over our populations, that they want to transform a lockdown generation into a reset generation. This is their words. This is not something taken from a conspiracy theory website. So we now need to be on guard for our own freedoms. We need to speak boldly and aggressively against this agenda, to expose it at the front end, but we also need to make it real to people. We need to speak in language that everyday people understand, something Dan is very good at doing. Tell people that this does not just translate into the violation of some principle in a political science textbook. It means doubling the costs of heating your home, of driving your kids to school. It means your food will become more expensive and the jobs that pay your wages will become more scarce. It means that more and more money will be printed by central banks to enrich those who have financial assets at the expense of those who are working and earning wages and income through their labor. It is a massive wealth transfer and a political power transfer to a small and organized and distant elite that are accountable to no one. And in fact, many of their faces and names are not even known to the people over whom they exercise this control. We need to make that point crystal clear. And finally, we need to speak about the alternative, which is a big, open, free market economy that where businesses must compete for customers and workers by raising wages and cutting consumer prices, by opening the door for challengers to take on the incumbents, by giving the outsiders the chance through hard work and diligence to achieve their dreams, by allowing the underdog to take on the fat cat. That is the alternative to this dystopian vision that our opponents in these international movements are putting forward. And so let us go forward with growing confidence, as Churchill would say, as we reclaim victory and restore our freedom and build a stronger country. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I got to get to the unmute button there. Thank you, Pierre. And boy, I totally agree. The importance of conveying what this means to average people is what needs to be prioritized, to my way of thinking anyway, because people think this is some lofty thing that's happening on the other side of the world. And it is in part happening on the other side of the world, but it's going to come home to roost for your average citizen. In fact, it already is happening. We already see things like our heating bills increase and so on and so forth. But that is the challenge. How do we communicate effectively those basic impacts on average people's lives and standard of living? Anyway, I'll move on. And our final panelist is Dr. Jack Mintz. Jack is one of the foremost tax experts in Canada. He is a former president of the C.D. Howe Institute. He's a longtime academic economist who has worked at several universities, a very frequent columnist in the media. You'll often see his columns in the National Post and elsewhere. And he's currently the President's Fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Jack.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm going to kind of start where Pierre left off, and that is recently I've been reading a number of different pieces, some of it written by academics, some of it written by others, and it's really on the reset, but let me put it in other terms. Really what people are saying is we have to build back better, and we got to build back better our social contract. And then they go through a list of various things that we need to do. For example, guaranteed annual income. And if you read the Senate report that came out, and Pierre won't be able to blame you for this Senate report, but it's, as I wrote about, it could cost $160 billion per year, the way that it's been formulated, with very significant impacts on the willingness of people to work. There's also mention of people make of long-term care, child care, pharmacare, and we know that the NDP have proposed dental care, but that's also in the list often I've seen of social rebuilding the social contract. And we know that that will also cost billions and billions of dollars to do. And then there's people will talk about made in Canada supply chains, shortening supply chains. I think there's some argument about that, but we have to remember that we are a small country and we depend on trade. And there is an issue that you have to think about in terms of that, because can we really just rely on ourselves, or are we going to have to work with other countries in order to get what we want, including something like vaccines? We're not producing the vaccines, they're being produced elsewhere right now. And then finally, on the list is decarbonization, and that we must move faster and quicker along decarbonization. Now, I think that list is very interesting because what does it miss? Well, it misses really probably the imperative that most Canadians are thinking about right now, and that is they want to get back to work and they want to start earning more income. And that, I think, is in fact really part of the social contract, is providing a job. And as we know, that's probably the highest level of charity, is providing a job to somebody. And so we should be really thinking about that, and we need to think about growth. And we also know that we do have a problem in Canada before the COVID hit, and that is our investment climate has been very poor. Do you know that we are now investing less in every industry except for residential real estate in Canada since 2014? Even trade, and it's not just oil and gas, trade, manufacturing, many of the services, etc. And our productivity has been flat, meaning that the amount of output we produce for every working hour has not increased since 2014. And you can't pay for anything if we're going to have low productivity in this country. And so that's another problem we have. And then we also have to remember that this COVID recession is having a dramatic effect on government deficits and debt that Pierre has mentioned. But let me just ask the following question. You know, in terms of rebuilding the social contract, where is the money going to come from? And that's going to be a key issue. Is it going to be coming from new taxes like payroll taxes, hikes in GST, HST, et cetera? Or you know, some of the people that have a pipe dream think that we could have all these new programs by simply running up debt and printing money. And under modern monetary theory, they think that that won't cause any inflation because it won't have any impact on bank lending to the market. And then that's what causes inflation. Banks give money to the market then puts deposits back into the bank, and then the bank then relends that money, and that causes additional demand for goods and services. But all that spending that's going to go on is an issue, and Canada, which actually has amongst the G7 countries, the highest current account deficit, meaning that we borrow more from internationally than we spend, or we have to borrow internationally to fund our private consumption, our government spending, and our private and public investment. We need to bring money in, and it's about 3.7% of GDP in 2019, which is equal to about the United Kingdom. Germany is running a surplus, for example. So we depend very much on the international world willing to lend us money. And high indebted countries eventually get into trouble when financial lenders decide we're not going to give you any more money, and then all of a sudden you can't float your bonds. And that causes interest rates to go up. And during the pandemic, from February to March, a good example of this was Argentina. Its bond rate went up 17 percentage points in 3 months' time. And as we know, Argentina was highly indebted. And what did they do by August? They basically reneged on their government debt to the international market. Not the first time, but they've repeated that experience. But we are in a totally different world after this COVID experience, and we're going to have governments that are going to be short of money. So how can we start spending a whole bunch of new money when we also want to have healthcare and education and all the important things that society has emphasized over the years? And then what's also missing in all this is entrepreneurship and sectoral strategies and ways of trying to get all parts of Canada to work better, including the oil and gas sector. And let me say a few things about the oil and gas sector, just to to talk about its importance to the Canadian economy. We have to ask the question, and I think this is an interesting question to ask. What happens if there was no oil and gas sector today? Let's say we just banned it, stopped all production of oil and gas in Canada. What would that mean? Well, first of all, our GDP would fall about 10%. That would be worse, double the COVID recession right now for 2020. That is not a very nice outcome. that would really impact on Canada altogether in terms of lost jobs, lost employment, lost income for many people. Why? Because it's not just the oil and gas sector that will be affected, but it's all the suppliers. And also we're going to have to import any oil and gas we need to refine it for people to drive and heat their homes and everything else. And if you do that, it's probably going to cost you more money too. So that is that's the implication that you get from that. What would it also mean? Well, it would also mean the loss of revenues for governments. And the Canadian Energy Centre, which actually puts out some pretty interesting pieces of information, which I encourage anyone to look at, they have estimated that the oil and gas sector has provided $493 billion to governments between the years 2000 and 2018, all measured in 2020 dollars. You do that in order to compare money in 2000 after inflation. We know that it makes a difference. And so it's indexing for inflation. And so $493 billion, that's a huge amount of revenue. And that revenue, of course, goes to federal and provincial governments that funds a lot of services that we want to have. And without it, that means governments are going to be scrimping for revenue from other sectors of the economy. And then finally, if we had no oil and gas sector, we would also lose our largest export item. It's roughly $130 billion in 2019 of energy that we export to the rest of the world, primarily United States in particular. And that is more than vehicles and auto parts, which is about $80 billion. So it just tells you that if we didn't have an oil and gas sector, the Canadian dollar would significantly devalue. And what would that mean? It would mean that imported prices would go up. Sure, it would help the export industries in Canada, like manufacturing and others, if the Canadian dollar was worth less. But basically, we are impoverishing our country when we do that, because a lower dollar means that our salaries are less relative to the rest of the world, and our ability to purchase goods and services from the rest of the world is more expensive. And in fact, we would probably suffer a brain drain, because imagine if we devalue to, let's say, 50 cents US dollars, our salaries would be so much lower than the US. Maybe we'll attract businesses because of cheap labor, but our very best people will say, you know what, I'm going to go to the United States or other countries where I can get a better salary. So that's not a very good outcome at all. So when I think about recovery and what we need to do for recovery, I think we have to really be focused on four things. First, we have to get people back to work. And that means economic growth. That's the number one item. The second is that we need to have a better investment climate, whether it's attracting foreign capital into this country or even encouraging more domestic investment in this country. That's absolutely critical. We're also going to have to be looking after the COVID recession for fiscal sustainability. And just to kind of make a point that I've been saying is that, yes, we needed to help people with the lockdowns, there's no question, but we went overboard. When you look at the recent OECD study that came out last week, per capita household income went up 10% in Canada in the second quarter. And that's with the decline in employment income, but so much money was spent by governments, federal and provincial governments, that it ended up causing the people to actually make more money. In other words, we went too far. And if you look at most other countries, except the United States, their support to the economy was about keeping household income flat. In other words, they compensated for the loss of employment and investment income, but they didn't go overboard. In fact, Canada went way overboard compared to any other country because we did not have a good targeted approach to support people. There were a lot of people that didn't need the support and got it, or got way too much relative to what they needed. And so it was very poorly done. We cannot, we go through this next version of this winter of COVID and health restrictions, I think that we're going to have to be very careful not to go overboard like we did just recently. And then finally, we need an energy plan. We need an energy plan that has 3 parts to it. Number one, reliable, cheap energy. You know, wind and solar is fine up to a point. Everybody knows you have to have a base load behind it in order to make up for the fact that it's intermittent. And when you do that, of course, you have problems in the sense it's going to be making it more expensive for that reason. We also need to a plan to reduce carbon. We should quit just identifying targets and think that we should just be talking about getting to a target. We should be thinking about the costs of getting to that target. And a good example to me is the clean fuel standard the right one? It's impractical. Very few jurisdictions apply it to natural gas, and it just apply it to fuel. But if we're already having a carbon tax and we already have fuel taxes, what's the point of the clean fuel standard? It makes no sense, really, from a public policy perspective. It's not achieving anything, yet if it does apply to natural gas, including carbon taxation, we could be potentially seeing a doubling of natural gas prices in this country. And that is not a very good outcome at all, certainly in terms of competitiveness and everything else. And so we have to have a plan that's going to be least cost to reduce our emissions, not one that's going to bury the Canadian economy, where we have been able to benefit very strongly from a very strong resource sector over the years that has given us much prosperity to this country. So Catherine, I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Jack. That's enough doom and gloom for any for any day. But yes, these are the kind of messages that obviously not enough people are getting. Because if you see, for example, a doubling of natural gas, just to use that example, when so many people heat their home and use natural gas in so many ways, that will, I would suspect, cause a repeat of what happened in Ontario with the hydro. Finally, they kicked the bums out politically, but the damage was done, and we're still left with the legacy of the mess that was caused by the Green Energy Act in Ontario. Well, I've been trying to sort of keep a bit of an eye on the questions in the chat at the same time as everything else. I don't know, Troy, do you want to weigh in on, I know you've been sort of eyeballing.
I've got a lot of questions here, but I just wonder quickly before we jump into some of the audience stuff, if maybe Dan or Jack, maybe could just explain exactly what the clean fuel standard is. I'm not sure that everyone understands what it is by definition. People in the media even not understanding. So maybe just define it and also provide some understanding of what the implications are of it.
Jack, if you don't mind, the clean fuel standard, which is a misnomer because we've achieved clean fuel standards in this country in terms of tailpipe emissions, it's really an attempt by the government to reduce to 30 tons below the benchmark that is set for 2030. Further reduce the amount of emissions, carbon emissions in particular, and it really should be called the carbon reduction program, but it amounts to a taxation, not just on end users, as we see currently with, say, diesel, gasoline, natural gas, or propane. It's also extending beyond gasoline, beyond liquid fuels, into solid fuels like coal, into gaseous fuels like natural gas. And so it becomes not just at the end user level, it also becomes at every stage of development of that particular hydrocarbon. So from extraction to distribution to transportation to production, and then finally to the end use. So it's really a cascading tax, if you will, that is applied and ultimately paid for by consumers. Hence why back in August, we wrote about this and said, this is really a second carbon tax. It is a stealth tax. No other country in the world has ever dared undertake this, and there's a good reason for it. According to the study that we put forward by LFX and Associates, which just came out at the beginning of October, no other country has done this simply because no even economist based on, and one who certainly subscribes to the idea of carbon taxes, would ever dare, and I think Jack spoke very, very powerfully to this, would ever dare apply a second tax. It makes the first tax inefficient and it actually reduces the outcome. The effect of the CFS tax in Canada will mean 30,000 jobs net lost. It will mean about $22 billion fleeing the country. as investors look for other places to heal, to shield the implications. And it will mean a significant hit to provincial, federal, and even municipal treasuries as a result. We're looking at a circumstance here, for instance, in Ontario, of direct costs of compliance being about $3.9 billion. That works out, by the way, just in Ontario alone, to $550 in additional cost to every worker in this province. The numbers don't get better across the country. We've done studies for other provinces as well, but the clean fuel standard is really overreach. Economists generally do not like it. And unfortunately for us, the federal government did not provide adequate, accurate, or I think informed reason and data to formulate its assumption. And the worst part of this is yet to come, Troy. I think the federal government is going to put this into legislation. As our legislation is passed, is going to make it law of the land as early as next week, along with plans to introduce legislation on net zero. So all this really means big, problems for consumers, but it also means significant dislocation for a country. No other country has attempted this, as I've mentioned earlier, and it's for good reason.
So let me summarize quickly some of the questions that came in last night, as well as some of the themes that we're seeing also repeating themselves as the discussion goes on live right now. Number one question that came in, especially last night, how is it that Trudeau is allowed to spend money seemingly without a vote in Parliament? Where's the accountability on that front? We haven't had a budget in this country since March of 2019. Catherine, I'm just gonna run out a couple of questions because I just so we can get a whole bunch of material out there. The debt, the spending, obviously very important. How do we get people to care about it, to engage in it? I worked for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation 26 years. I carted the national debt clock out across the country. Crowds came out to see that thing in the 1990s. People were much more concerned and engaged at that time than they seem to be today. How do we bridge that gap of people seemingly just not making the connection to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about? Some of our folks from Ontario, to speak to the question of Western alienation, we had a conference last weekend where a few of the panelists from Ontario talked about how important the energy sector is, especially for those folks out west, and how connected it is to the Ontario economy. And I think that point needs to be made. And the last point I'll raise, and before handing it off, do we need to challenge some of the underlying reasoning that is driving some of these policies in order to change the policies themselves, i.e. zero emission targets, zero cases of COVID, to use examples? You can complain about the symptoms, but until you address the root causes of some of these zero objectives, is it time to open the debate about those subjects themselves? So I'll leave those sort of 4 points with you, Catherine, to address the panel with, and then I've got some others that are coming in as well.
Okay, thanks, Troy. Pierre, do you want to speak to the not having had a budget issue and how can they get away with this?
Yeah, so in our political system, you don't actually need a budget to furnish governments with funds. They get that authorization through something called the estimates, which is an appropriation of funds for the operations of government, and through amendments to the law, we call them the statutes of Canada, which empower governments to create certain broadly defined programs, like EI, for example. So for EI, if Parliament shut down forever, EI would keep functioning because its formula is baked right into the law, and it just runs like a computer program that's already been coded. So what they have done is passed numerous spending appropriation bills with very broad language that allows them to spend almost any amount of money on anything they want, without going back for specific and item by item authorizations that we are accustomed to seeing. So they have obtained that power, and they're using it broadly. So for example, the WE grant, that no one came before Parliament and said, we'd like to give $500 million to the WE organization. They just had broad powers, spending powers, which they seized right in the heart of the pandemic back in March, to spend on anything that was related to protecting public health and the Canadian economy. And so they basically took that to the public servants and said, look, we have authorization to spend basically any amount on anything we choose at any time without any restriction. Now, we were, as Conservatives, we were able to limit the time frame of these powers. So many of them actually lapsed at the end of September. So the spending authorizations they have today are significantly constrained versus what they had in the middle of the lockdown. And they will be constrained further and further. You won't see, I don't think even the Bloc and the NDP will allow them to have unrestrained authorizations to spend the next time they come forward. They will have to have clearly delineated proposals that go before the House, the Finance Committee, then the Senate and the Senate Finance Committee, and they'll have to have full scrutiny. But frankly, they were able to use the emergency of the pandemic to acquire these powers. So for example, they said to people who were being locked down and risked eviction from their apartments onto the street with no money for groceries, either the Parliament passed the sweeping powers for us now, or you get nothing. That was it was a bloody-minded strategy, but they managed to get NDP support for it. Even the more conscientious members of the NDP and Bloc had to collapse under the political pressure. So we are going to fight hard to restrain their ability to spend as we go forward. And remember, they wanted to go a lot further. They actually wanted to seize the power to raise any tax they wanted until the year 2022 without going back to Parliament. We stopped that. We forced them to back down. But that was a window into the mind of the Prime Minister and to the power lust that he has displayed since this crisis began.
Actually, I think that leads in nicely to one of the other points you mentioned, Troy. You said, Pierre, the political pressure was too great, so they realized they had to have some kind of constraints on their out of control spending. How do we effectively engage people? They're distracted. The pandemic is the perfect cover because, of course, everybody's so distracted by it. They're not paying the attention to the debt that's being built up. And I remember the mid-90s too, when we almost hit the wall as a country and they had to scale back. And all the public opinion polls at that time showed a significant majority of Canadians were very worried about debt and deficit.
Yes.
That doesn't seem to be the case today. So, how do we, and again, the pandemic is a smokescreen that's quite effective, understandably, because people are worried about it. But how do we get beyond that? And I don't know, Dan, maybe if you have some comments on that. How can we more effectively engage the average voter to exert the pressure we need to have exerted to get the politicians? Because really, the Liberals federally, as long as the NDP keeps propping them up, or sometimes the Bloc, they've got a perfect scenario because they've effectively got a majority government for all intents and purposes. So I don't know, Dan, if you have some comments on how you would approach that.
Just two reminders, and I try to explain this to people. My early days as a young Liberal, the 1981 experience of 21% mortgage rates really focused the attention of a lot of people on what happens when government spending, as Jack has quite rightly pointed out, it seems to be out of control. The second, of course, is the appetite. It will take some time, but I think this rather than a recovery based on recidivism and going towards something that we know will not work, and that's this green energy build back better nonsense, to explain to people that in order to get out of this, we have to be fiscally sound. And I think that's something that they'll all understand, as long as it's in the context of building and growing the economy. What concerns me is, of course, we had momentum in the late 80s, but definitely in the early 90s towards trimming that debt, because people understood the relationship between removing the federal government or dropping government debt and allowing interest rates to drop so that they in turn couldn't just afford a home and a car, they could afford other things as well. I think we need to get back to that point. I don't want to say it's going to take a good, great recession after this to prove to people, but the last thing that there's a problem, but the last thing that we need right now is to compound the problem by adding more cost to consumers and to business and to really undermine the ability for the country to grow at a time when perhaps if we get rid of the oil and gas sector, as many of these Liberals are saying today, and their allies, progressive woke allies, are suggesting, we're likely to lead to not just a great reset, we're likely to lead to a significant downgrade in our economic performance, the likes of which are going to leave a lot of people, especially here in Toronto, wondering whether or not they can make the mortgage payments to keep their homes. And there goes your real estate industry.
Yeah, the one difference we had in the 90s, but we actually had a liberal government in power, and you were part of it, Dan, that took deficits seriously and took that seriously. We don't have that now. We also have, I think, the left. You have to give them credit. They've been immensely successful at convincing a lot of people deficits don't matter. Jack, you referred to modern monetary theory, which is spend yourself stupid and it'll all be fine, in a very simplistic nutshell. But this, I don't know, Jack, if you have a view on how do we communicate this better to get the it's a game of political pressure. There's no question about it. That is ultimately what will change things.
Well, I think what's going to happen is eventually the rubber will hit the road, and that's when people are going to finally get worried. And that's the trouble, is people don't react until they see the crisis actually coming. One of the problems, though, right now is that people feel that they can get a lot of things without having to spend or pay for it. If it's a matter of government spending money and then just printing money, it's not going to have a consequence because the banks will just absorb it. That's one view. In other words, we can go out and spend all we want. There's no financial constraint on governments, and there won't be any problem that will occur. It's obviously a stupid concept, but it's one which is pushed by the modern monetary theory people. But I can tell you, very few economists really think that makes sense. Now, the other thing, of course, is that people say, well, we can have guaranteed annual incomes and long-term care and everything else, but we're going to get the rich to pay for it. We'll have a wealth tax and we'll have estate taxation. But as we know, even if you put these things in, and by the way, there's now only 4 OECD countries that have a wealth tax. And in fact, there used to be 13 in 1990, and 11 of them have gotten, 9 of them have dropped it, including France. That was the recent one. They've dropped their wealth taxes. Why? Because they didn't make much revenue out of it. And by the time you finish with exemptions, like for spouses and farmers and small business and et cetera, you don't raise much money. But also, why do you have a wealth tax? I mean, we already have income taxation on people's investment. Why do we have to slap on another tax? What's the point of it? It really doesn't make much sense. Well, there may be an argument about estate taxes, but we already have deemed realization of capital gains at death in Canada. In fact, in 1972 tax reform, when we brought in capital gains taxes. We also got rid of the estate tax at that time. In fact, every province got rid of their estate tax, except for Quebec, interestingly. And why did Quebec keep it? Because when the separatists won power, they knew that the Francophones wouldn't be moving out of Quebec, only the Anglophones. So they thought it was good policy until the Liberals got elected in 1984 under Robert Bourassa, and then he finally got rid of the estate tax in Quebec. But we do have deemed realization of capital gains at death. And I can tell you, there's hardly a country in the world that will do both. And so you have to ask the question, what's the point of bringing in the state tax for that reason? Anyway, the main thing is that you're not going to get much revenue anyway. If you're going to have a guaranteed annual income, it's going to cost you $160 billion. You're going to have a major payroll tax, a major hike to GST rates, major tax hikes to income taxes. People are going to have to pay more if they want this stuff. And that's going to be the realism. So that's why I say eventually the rubber will hit the road. And we already have a competitiveness problem in this country. And even my good friend, David Dodge, has raised this as a major issue that we're going to have to think about. And I can tell you, if we load on, just as Dan said, we load on more costs on the Canadian economy, we discourage investment, we discourage growth, it's going to make recovery very hard and very difficult. And that's what happened in some countries after the financial crisis. The ones that actually had more of a growth policy ended up doing better than the ones that didn't. And I think that's really an important thing to remember. And that's why I say recovery is all about growth and getting people back to work and incomes back into Canada. And all this other stuff is going to have to wait. You know, everyone said, oh, we didn't have this before the COVID. We have to fix all these problems. Well, we had money before the COVID period, and we didn't fix every problem that there is in the world at that time. It's going to be even less money now after the COVID period, and we're not going to be able to afford a whole bunch of new social policies because we could actually undermine some of the good things that we have right now in the system, like our healthcare system and our education system.
Yeah, like I saw someone, I can't remember who, say the laws of economics didn't change because COVID came along. We have even worse constraints that we had prior. But once again, though, you know, we get back to this theme of how do you communicate? You want to talk about tax the rich. That appeals to a lot of people because it sounds good, and it doesn't mean they're going to be taxed, at least in their, you know, in their minds. And again, the people promoting that have done an effective job.
Can I jump on that very quickly? You know, when the Liberals raised the top marginal rate from 28% to 33% federally, they actually saw a decline in revenue from the wealthiest taxpayers in the 2016 tax year. And that was, they claimed, well, that was just a one-time effect because a bunch of rich people moved income into 2015 to avoid the forthcoming tax increase. One of them, by the way, was Bill Morneau. He sold millions of dollars of shares in December of 2015 in order to ensure he didn't have to pay his own tax increase. But then in New Brunswick and in Ontario, they did likewise. They brought in new provincial tax increases on the wealthiest, and those provinces also saw a decline in revenue paid by the wealthiest 1%. And CRA publishes a report typically in July to tell us what was the breakdown of the tax contribution by the various income groups in the country. That report should for the year 2019 should have come out already in July. Well, they're actually delaying that until January. They claim because of COVID. I think the real reason why they're delaying this report is that it will show that after 4 years of Trudeau being in power, with all of these tax increases and all of the one-time kinks being worked out in the tax increases, so there's no more excuse. I think this report will show that the rich are actually paying less now, a lower share of the tax burden than they were under Harper, even though the rates are higher. And that's because the Laffer curve is undeniable. It is not a debate anymore. The reality is when taxes get high enough on any particular income group, they can move their money out of the country, they can use crafty accounting, they can go to the black market, as many high income blue collar business owners like tradespeople often do. And of course, they can make the decision to just stop working altogether. And that is what my friend's wife, who's a doctor, did. She just stopped doing Friday appointments because the money she earns Fridays was lost in taxes. So she sees fewer patients, and she pays actually less taxes now than she did before because she would rather recreate than pay or earn money to pay in taxes. A very, very, very quick anecdote. I was just reading about Dionysius, who was the Greek dictator who controlled Syracuse on the island of Sicily, which is then Greek control 2,400 years ago. And he was always broke because he was spending like crazy. So he decided to bring in a cattle tax. They taxed the cows of the farmers. And so they started immediately slaughtering their cattle in order to avoid paying the taxes because it was better for them to do that. And so he said, no, you can't slaughter anything more than you use in a given day. And they said, okay, well, we've suddenly become very religious and be engaged in mass slaughter to sacrifice to the gods as many of their cattle as humanly possible. And of course, he couldn't object to that because to do so would be sacrilege. The point being, when taxes get high enough throughout all of history, the story is the same. People will be forced to destroy their own livelihoods to avoid paying those taxes. And that is not a new lesson. It's a lesson that we have been taught over thousands of years.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard that anecdote before. And as a vegetarian, I don't like it. But I think, you know, the governments over the centuries that have tried to tax the rich, however that's defined, you would think if it ever was going to work, they would have figured out how to do it by now. So I think, you know, the fact that they haven't tells you it's not going to work ever.
Yeah.
Dan, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I think we have to be mindful that it won't be a direct tax that we understand or see. And you know, Pierre has put it very, very clearly. The Pan-Canadian framework, which basically gives rise to things like the CFS and will increase the cost of living, also sees things like radical building codes, methane taxes. I'm looking at offset purchases. I think we have to be really mindful and head towards understanding what this government is prepared to do to increase the burden on consumers and on business in Canada without many of us being aware of it. One of the outcomes of, I think, this discussion has to be, how do we head them off of the past? Because those are coming, they're imminent, they're likely to happen in the next couple of weeks before the House rises for the winter, or rather Christmas break.
Point. One of the other points, just to change gears a little bit here, you had mentioned, I think, Troy, the whole notion of questioning some of the COVID parameters, like the fact that, well, we have so much confusion at this point. It's sort of hard to figure. But what was the angle on that?
We're going to get to 0 cases of COVID and
Yeah.
zero emissions. I mean, this is pie in the sky stuff, right? And a lot of policies are being driven by these objectives. And so some of the questions are coming, do we open this debate? The root causes of what's driving a lot of this, I think, is what's coming through many of the questions.
Any of the panelists want to comment on that?
Well, let me start with the one on zero emissions and targets. What I find really problematical right now is that we have a federal government that likes to identify a target. It does zero research on the economic impacts of that target and the cost of it. And to give you an idea, and I have a piece coming out in the Post soon on this, but if you look at New Zealand, for example, a couple of years ago in 2017, they actually had a very detailed report looking at 3 strategies of trying to get to net zero by 2050. One strategy is just use carbon pricing. And they said, okay, we can get to net zero with an $850 carbon price. Not exactly cheap. And there would be potentially a 14% decline in GDP compared to doing nothing by 2050. 14% is a huge loss in GDP. And in fact, it kind of makes you wonder, is the target really sensible in the first place? Maybe we'd be better off accepting whatever happens in terms of the weather and things like that, and climate change, and any potential damage, and use mitigation, remedial actions, and that may cost some money if we do have abrupt events as being predicted. But you know, those are the sort of things to look at. Even in terms of the impact, there's a lot of uncertainty. I've gone through a lot of the various reports, and there was an excellent piece I read by some economists and climate change experts. I'm in the former category. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on climate change, but it was very interesting that when you look at the predictions under various models, and they're just models, they're not forecasting models. They're not really. You know, to really understand is you have to backdate to see how accurate these models are. Well, they have a very wide range in terms of potential temperature increases. But it's very interesting is that when you look at the backdating of those models, at least so far, they tend to be at the bottom of the temperature range, which is a very wide range. And so that sort of suggests that, you know, maybe we're going to have to see what the implications are of climate change. But we have to really think about a plan. If we're going to be moving this direction, we have to think of a plan that really lays out what all the costs that people are going to understand. and whether the target is even sensible in the first place. And so, unfortunately, we don't do that. And we basically have a government that's committed to moving in a certain direction, even faster than most other countries around the world. And we know that global warming is, or climate change as it's now called, because if the world isn't warming, at least we can have some other identifier of the problem. But if global warming is an issue, then it's an international issue. And Canada just working on its own won't solve the problem. It has to have all the other countries doing that. And as we know, China, which is the major emitter now in the world, responsible for almost a third of all emissions. It's a little less than that. But you know, it's still building coal plants. It's not planning to start reducing emissions for another decade at least. And who knows what they do in a decade. But but if you actually look at emissions around the world since 2010, the countries outside of the advanced countries have let their emissions go up by 22% over the past decade. So this really, if people are really going to address this problem, Canada has to really just be harmonized with the rest of the world and not be trying to move ahead of the rest of the world.
David, did you want to say something?
Just to jump in, there's been several questions that have come in, and this was, if I could, Catherine, it was directed toward Pierre about pushback on the Green New Deal. A whole buckets of conversation have come into that, but if I could capture it, what's the deal about the Green Deal and what can be done to express a different point of view, if I could? Or if the questions could.
Well, first of all, listen, we have to start to use the left's arguments against them. They claim that they're so concerned about the growing gap between rich and poor, that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and hence we need all these new taxes, they say, to balance things out. Well, the single biggest wealth transfer from the working class to the super rich in Canadian history was the Green Energy Act in Ontario, which doubled electricity bills for little old ladies on fixed incomes in order to pay subsidies worth thousands of % in price markups to wealthy insiders who were able to land contracts to sell that phony electricity onto the grid. Insiders on Bay Street and elsewhere went to the government, got these contracts to receive 90 cents a kilowatt hour for something worth 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. In other words, a 20-fold price markup. Overwhelmingly, the recipients of these subsidies are affluent in the least and very wealthy at the best. The poor people of this province do not have solar panels on their rooftops, and they certainly don't have shares in the companies that made all the money, and they certainly don't have the political connections to have been to play the arbitrage game of securing the contract from the Ontario energy system, and then reselling it in the same year to someone else at a huge profit. All of those people who got rich quick off this are the privileged elite, and all of the people who paid the bill are the working poor. In fact, the Ontario, this is not just some theory of mine, the Ontario Association of Food Banks created a new term, energy poverty, and published a report with a light bulb on the front and told the story of people literally coming into the food bank with their power bills and saying, I can't eat because my power bill has gotten so expensive, and therefore I need you to feed me. That is reverse Robin Hood. That is the Sheriff of Nottingham pillaging the working poor to profit the aristocratic elite inside the castle walls. And that is exactly what will happen with this Green New Deal. There will be a huge ecosystem of parasitical, well-lobbied for elites who will feast off of all of these subsidies and regulatory transfers and other benefits, at the expense of the working poor who have no lobbyists, no accountants, no consultants, no lawyers who can go to bat for them. They will see their power bills rise, their food costs will go up, and a political elite that is well connected will become fantastically rich off it. And I think we need to make that point especially, because it strikes at the heart of the whole socialist narrative. It's supposed to be, socialism is supposed to be about sharing the wealth, not hoarding it and taking it from the most vulnerable. So the answer is that we should fight this New Deal, this Green New Deal, and we should come forward with real environmental policies that conserve the wilderness, that protect the wild, that allow all of us to profit responsibly from the free enterprise system, especially the working people at the bottom of the economic ladder. They should have the opportunity to rise up, and they should not face the penalties that these policies will impose on them.
Thank you.
Pierre, you've made the same point, I think, effectively with respect to the printing money that's going on right now. The bondholders, the wealthy people, are the ones that are the beneficiaries of all this money that's being printed so that you know, it can fund all these COVID programs and goodness knows what all else the government wants to do. But it ultimately doesn't help your you know, average person, certainly not low income.
Catherine, we're coming to the point in time, a great session where we're going to have to begin the wind down. And I think we have time for perhaps one more question and then your closing and then the closing remarks.
Okay. One question, if I can abuse my privilege as moderator, that I'd like to ask is, Pierre, are the Conservatives planning to do anything to push back against the whole Build Back Better mantra?
Yes, I spoke out against it in the Finance Committee yesterday. I posted that online yesterday evening. I'm collecting petition signatures on my website with Pierre.ca. We're exposing this agenda and speaking out strongly against it. I encourage you to go to my Twitter page, my Facebook page, or my website with Pierre.ca to sign my petition. And we will fight this tooth and nail.
Terrific. Well, I mean, some former conservative governments have signed on to various UN things, and a lot of people sign on to these things because it's viewed as non-binding and so on and so forth. But then ultimately, it, you know, by stealth, it ends up being quite binding ultimately. So
no, we're not signing on to this. Not our party. Our party won't be signing on to this garbage.
Good. I guess now that was a good call to action, and I'd like to ask Jocelyn Bamford, the president and founder of the coalition, to close with also with a call to action. But Pierre, that's a very good call to action for everyone on this call, and you know, spread the word to sign on to Pierre's petition.
So thank you, Catherine. Yes, thank you. I'm Jocelyn Bamford, president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers, and I want to thank our great guests and great panel. So thank you to Pierre, Poilievre, Catherine Swift, Dan McTeague, and Jack Mintz. What a wonderful discussion. It's great to get people together to have these kind of discussions. I think they're very timely. And I'd like to thank our moderators, Troy Lanigan and David Sword, for helping us out, and to our partners, the Strong and Free Network, the Alberta Institute, Project Confederation, and of course, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. But most especially, I want to thank you for showing up. You took the time today to come and listen and talk, and that is really important. I can't underscore how important that is. We had over 1,200 people sign up for this session, and it just shows that two things: that people are concerned about preserving our democracy, our liberty, and they're motivated to do something about it. And that was just dialing into this call today. But I'd like you to take that desire and translate it to action. You are all here because an organization invited you, and each one of these organizations have a petition. Pierre himself has a petition on his website, so please take the time to sign these petitions. The coalition petition is for a responsible recovery, one that includes our resource sector, our manufacturing, and pushes back on this plastic ban that's going to be so damaging to the 35 billion with the B dollars of revenue that comes in from that marketplace. So if you can take time to sign those petitions and push back on this Green New Deal, this reset, this agenda that is going to absolutely take prosperity and jobs from our economy. And do it not only for yourself and if you're an employer, for your employees, but for their families and their children as well as our children. So take those few minutes to do that. And then I urge you to also call your MP. Call them and tell them that we don't agree with the reset. We don't agree with the Green New Deal. We believe our resources and our manufacturing and our plastic sector can be a vehicle for prosperity and jobs in this country. So let's them not take your prosperity, your freedom, your liberty, and our democracy. And let's stand up today. This is the first step in a journey. It's a journey of 1,000 steps, and we appreciate that you took this journey with us today. And I'm just going to close by saying our coalition's mantra is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So thank you all for coming today. Let's join together and let's push back on this radical agenda and preserve our freedoms. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I just want to underscore too, don't stop with, people think it's a waste of time to contact MPs and whatnot. It is not. I can assure you, having spent decades working on behalf of small business and entrepreneurs, it is paid attention to. And once they even get more than 5 or 6 calls, suddenly it's an issue. Don't stop at your federal MP. Go to your provincial member of the legislature, whatever it happens to be, provincial parliament, and cities. Municipalities are leaders on this UN agenda. Every single medium to large town to city in this country is a signatory to the UN 2030 social SDGs. So go to your local politicians as well. And also your banks, most large corporations have signed on. You know, this is something that this can be very, very effective to let people know they're not going to get away with it. I think that's because so much of it they feel they're going to get away with because people aren't paying enough attention, and the pandemic has simply made it even more complex. Finally, Troy, I've seen some comments saying, is this going to be available as a video somewhere?
Canada Strong and Free.network. You can Google it or go to that address directly. I'll try to have it posted in the next couple hours. There'll be a link to please share on your social media channels and otherwise. Let's get this message out. Let's keep the conversation going, and let's engage all the organizations that were talked about earlier in fighting back against this stuff. Great.
Well, I think that's it, folks. Once again, thanks very much for joining us. This is such an important issue. We need all the support, all the networking, and all the communication that we can possibly get. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.